Welcome to Royal History UK, where the past comes alive.
Okay, so you want to own a castle. Buy the land, raise the walls, hang a flag from the tower, and spend the rest of your life collecting rent from the peasants below while your knights patrol the grounds. Simple enough, here is the problem. That picture, the one of effortless power and permanent wealth sitting behind 2-meter-thick walls, is almost completely wrong. A medieval castle was not a vault. It was not a money-making machine. For most of the families who owned one, it was the single most expensive, most demanding, and most financially dangerous asset they would ever possess. The stone walls went up fast. The money went out faster. And here is the part nobody tells you. The biggest cost of owning a castle was not the construction. It was not the garrison. It was not even the wars. The biggest cost was simply existing, day after day, year after year, in a building that was designed to project power, not generate it. So let us talk about what it actually cost to own a medieval castle. Not the legend, the ledger. Before you even think about stone and mortar, you need to understand one thing. A castle on its own is worth almost nothing. Less than nothing, actually. A fortress sitting in the middle of empty fields with no villages around it, no farms producing grain, no river running nearby, and no road passing through, that is not a seat of power. That is a very expensive stone box that costs you money every single day. Under the feudal system that governed England, France, and most of Western Europe throughout the medieval period, the true wealth of any lord was determined by the land he controlled around the castle, not the castle itself. The countryside had to be organized into what was called a manor, a network of tenant villages, productive farmland, managed forests, working watermills, rivers for fishing, and roads that merchants and travelers would use. Every one of those elements generated income. The castle alone generated almost none. Think about it this way. The castle was the administrative office at the center of a regional business. The business itself was the land. The people farming that land were paying rent and handing over a portion of every harvest. The mills were processing grain and charging a fee for every sack. The forests were producing timber, providing hunting rights and sheltering game. The rivers were yielding fish. And the roads were carrying merchants who could be taxed just for passing through. Without all of that surrounding the castle, the owner was simply bleeding money into stone walls with nothing coming back. This is the first and most important thing to understand. Ironically, the castle itself often made less money than the fields around it. Now let us talk about the entry price, because the cost of actually building a stone castle was, by any measure, staggering. And this was before you had spent a single penny on running it. Take Caernarfon Castle in North Wales, which King Edward I of England began building in the year 1283. Construction ran for nearly 50 years and cost between £20,000 and £25,000 in medieval money. Historians today estimate that figure translates to roughly $23.5 million in modern purchasing power. And that was for one castle. Edward was also building Conwy Castle at the same time, which cost around £15,000, and Harlech, which ran to about £10,000. And Beaumaris, which started in 1295 and was still unfinished by the 1320s, having consumed another £15,000 before the money simply ran out. His entire building campaign in Wales cost approximately £80,000 between 1277 and 1304, with more added in the years after. An £80,000 construction bill in the 1200s. The campaign contributed directly to the financial crisis that overwhelmed Edward's government in the late 1290s. And these were royal castles. The richest man in England was building them with the full tax revenue of a kingdom behind him. For a private noble family, even a relatively modest stone keep could represent years, sometimes decades, of accumulated income from their estates. Now here is where the costs get interesting. Because paying for the stone itself was almost the smallest part of the problem. Building a medieval castle required enormous quantities of limestone, structural timber, iron for nails and hinges, lead for roofing, and lime mortar to hold everything together. Sourcing all of that was expensive. But moving it to the building site? That was where the budget truly exploded. We have very precise records from Caernarfon from the years 1285 and 1286. In those accounts, the raw cost of purchasing all the building materials came to £151. The cost of actually transporting those same materials to the building site came to £535. Read that again. For every single pound spent buying the materials, the builder spent an additional £3.54 just getting them to the site. Why? Because medieval transportation was extraordinarily slow and expensive. Moving heavy stone by land meant ox carts on unpaved roads, slow, prone to breaking down, and inefficient. The only way to move large quantities of material cheaply was by water, river barge, or coastal ship. This is why you almost never see major medieval castles built far from a river or a coastline. Location was not chosen for the view. It was chosen because water access made the construction even remotely affordable. At the peak of building Caernarfon in February 1296, the records show that the master mason James of St. George, who was responsible for designing most of Edward's Welsh castles, submitted a request for £250 per week just to pay the wages of 400 masons, 200 quarrymen, 30 smiths, and 3,000 additional laborers on site. £250 per week. For one construction project, here is something that almost never comes up when people talk about castle construction. Keeping 3,000 workers on a building site for months at a time required an enormous amount of food. Bread, ale, salted meat, fish, and dried vegetables had to be procured and delivered continuously to keep the workforce alive and productive. During the peak summer building season at Beaumaris, where records show up 3,500 workers employed in the summer of 1295, the local agricultural economy in Anglesey could not produce enough food to supply the site. Grain and cured fish had to be imported by ship from other parts of England. The food bill during these long construction projects often exceeded the cost of the raw materials themselves. This is the trap that catches people completely off guard. You think you are paying for a building. You are actually paying for a small temporary town that happens to produce a building at the end of it. The building is finished. Now the real costs begin. Here is where most people's mental model collapses entirely. Because once the construction was done and the flags went up and the gates were opened, the expenses did not stop. They increased. A completed castle of any significant size required a permanent household staff just to function on a basic daily level. And that staff had to be fed, housed, clothed, and paid throughout the entire year, regardless of whether the lord was in residence. The World History Encyclopedia, drawing from medieval household records, notes that a large castle could have a household staff of at least 50 people covering all manner of specialized roles. And that is the minimum. A major regional stronghold, one of the kind that actually mattered politically, could house 100. You needed a castle steward, who was essentially the chief executive officer of the entire operation, managing accounts, legal matters, and estate administration. You needed a marshal to oversee the stables and military force. You needed a chaplain for daily religious services and correspondence, because he was one of the few people in the building who could read and write Latin. You needed a butler managing the wine cellar. You needed cooks, scullery workers, stable hands, pages, grooms, laundresses, blacksmiths, carpenters, and falconers. Most lower servants were paid by the day and dismissed when the lord traveled. But the skilled senior staff, the steward, the marshal, the chaplain, the constable, had to be retained year-round on annual contracts. They could not simply be let go when the harvest was bad or the war was dragging on. They were the administrative backbone that kept the entire estate from collapsing. Now add the garrison on top of all that domestic staff. The popular image of medieval military service is of noble knights riding in freely because they owe it to their lord as a feudal duty. The reality by the 13th and 14th centuries was mostly cash. Feudal obligation required vassals to show up for a limited number of days per year, typically around 40. Nobody built a military strategy around 40 days of unpaid service from farmers who also had harvests to worry about. For real, sustained defense, you needed professional soldiers on contract. We have solid records of what those soldiers cost. A knight in 14th century England was paid 2 shillings per day. A mounted archer received 6 pence per day. A foot soldier earned 2 pence per day. A crossbowman commanded 12 pence per day. To put those numbers into scale, keeping just 10 knights under contract for 1 full year cost around £365. That is without their horses, armor, weapons, or food. A war horse by the time of Edward I campaigns had risen in price to £60 per animal, compared to just £1 at the time of the Norman conquest a century earlier. Equipment costs had escalated dramatically as warfare became more sophisticated. During peacetime, sensible lords kept garrisons as small as possible. Caernarfon in 1284, a major royal castle and the administrative capital of North Wales, was defended by a garrison of 40 men in peacetime, and even that was considered more than usual for a non-emergency situation. But once a war started, or even a credible threat of one, those numbers had to scale immediately, and the cost per soldier tripled or more when you included mercenaries hired at emergency rates. The castle's biggest purpose was defense, but defense was not cheap. Stone lasted centuries. Everything else did not. The roofs of a medieval castle were typically covered in lead sheeting or clay tiles, both of which required constant attention. Wooden gates, drawbridges, floors, and support beams rotted in the damp. Arrow slits cracked. chimneys needed relining, wells needed dredging. The mortar between the stones needed repointing every generation. And severe weather, cold Welsh winters, freezing rain, howling coastal winds, accelerated all of it. The particularly cruel financial trap here is that deferred maintenance was not free. Every repair that was delayed simply became a bigger, more expensive repair later. A leaking roof left untreated for 3 winters could rot the structural support beams of an entire floor, requiring a far more costly reconstruction. A cracked foundation left unrepaired could destabilize an entire tower. Because these repairs required skilled stonecutters and carpenters working at height on external walls, the labor rates were significantly higher than for standard construction. You could not use your cheapest agricultural workers for this. You needed specialists, and specialists were expensive and not always easy to find. Here is one that modern people genuinely underestimate. Heating a medieval castle was one of the largest recurring expenses of the entire year. The very feature that made a castle defensible, thick stone walls, narrow windows, high vaulted ceilings, made it extremely cold and damp during winter. Medieval fireplaces, without proper flue dampers or insulated chimney systems, sent the vast majority of their heat directly up through the chimney. Cold air was constantly being drawn in through narrow window openings to replace it. Researchers studying reconstructions of large medieval buildings have estimated that simply maintaining a livable indoor temperature in a large stone hall required burning roughly 25 kilograms of hardwood per hour. Over a standard winter season, a single large hall could consume over 55 tons of firewood. And a castle of any size had multiple fireplaces, multiple heated chambers, and kitchen fires burning continuously. For a major castle, the winter fuel requirement reached hundreds of tons of wood. This meant the lord had to employ teams of woodcutters working through the autumn months, transport enormous quantities of timber by cart to the castle stores, and stack and dry it well enough to burn efficiently. The cost of fuel alone, just staying warm, represented one of the largest predictable expenses in the entire annual budget. On top of the fuel cost, consider the daily food bill. A castle household of significant size consumed grain, bread, ale, wine, meat, fish, and vegetables every single day of the year. The demand never stopped. The noble family and their senior staff ate from the high table. The garrison soldiers ate in the great hall. The domestic servants ate in the kitchens and lower halls. Every level of the hierarchy had to be provisioned according to their rank, with the quality and quantity of food serving as a visible signal of social status within the household. And then came the feasts. This is where the numbers become almost impossible to comprehend. At the installation feast for Archbishop George Neville at Cawood Castle in the year 1465, the household prepared food to serve 2,500 guests over the course of several days. The provisions consumed included over 100 oxen, 1,000 sheep, 304 calves, 2,000 pigs, 4,000 pigeons, 400 swans, and 300 barrels of ale alongside 100 barrels of wine. A single feast of that scale could easily consume months of the entire agricultural surplus produced by several tenant villages. And this was not an isolated event. For nobles operating at the top of the political hierarchy, hosting was not optional. It was how you demonstrated power. You could not be seen as weak, poor, or stingy. The feast was the advertisement, and like all advertising, it cost far more than it returned directly. Here is the expense that could arrive without any warning and ruin a family in a matter of days. The royal progress, medieval kings did not simply sit in one palace all year. They traveled continuously through their kingdoms with enormous traveling courts of hundreds of courtiers, guards, administrators, and servants, partly to project royal authority into distant provinces, partly to escape the unsanitary conditions of a court that had been in one place too long. And when the king came to visit, the lord who owned that castle paid for everything. Queen Elizabeth I progresses in 16th century England were so financially feared by the gentry that receiving an invitation to host the queen was received almost like a death sentence for the family finances. When Elizabeth visited Sir Thomas Egerton's Harefield estate in 1602, the cost of hosting the royal court for just 3 days came to £2,013, 18 shillings, and 4 pence, a sum equivalent to roughly $10 million in today's purchasing power. The household consumed 24 lobsters, 624 chickens, and used 48,000 bricks just to build temporary outdoor cooking ovens to handle the volume. Lord Burghley, one of Elizabeth's most powerful ministers, hosted the Queen at least 12 separate times. Each visit cost him between £2,000 and £3,000. He maintained a permanent banqueting infrastructure at his own expense throughout his entire career. Back in the medieval period, the same dynamic applied under different names. Lords owed military service, taxes, expensive diplomatic gifts, and campaign funding. The financial obligations flowed continuously upward through the feudal hierarchy. And unlike agricultural income, which at least varied with the harvest, these obligations could be called in at any time on short notice, at the king's discretion. The primary engine of income was the land itself. Tenant farmers paid rent, either in cash or in a share of their harvest. In England in the 13th century, a lord might hold 20, 30, or even hundreds of separate tenant holdings, each paying annually. Added together, these rents formed the baseline revenue that the castle operation depended on. On top of rent came the monopolies. Under the manorial system, a lord held exclusive rights over the essential processing infrastructure of the area. The most important of these was the mill. Peasants were legally prohibited from grinding their own grain at home. They had to bring it to the lord's mill, where the miller extracted a processing fee typically set between 1/24th and 1/16th of everything ground. In highly controlled urban areas like Chester, that fee could reach 15% of the total grain brought in. Across an entire manor processing the harvest of hundreds of tenant families, the milling monopoly alone generated between 20 and 30% of total non-agricultural income. Lords also collected fees from communal bakery ovens, wine and cider presses, fishing rights on the rivers, and hunting rights in the forests. None of these were enormous individually. Together, they added up to a steady stream of income that kept the lights on. Then came the courts. Every castle of significance held a regular manor court where the lord, or more often, his steward, exercised legal authority over the tenants. And legal authority in medieval Europe was a direct revenue source. Tenants paid filing fees simply to have disputes heard. They paid fines for letting livestock stray into the lord's crops. When a tenant died, his family paid an inheritance fee, called a heriot, delivering the family's best animal or a cash equivalent just to keep their landholding. Marriage required the lord's permission and a fee to obtain it. The court was not just administrative, it was financial. It could be a reliable and consistent income stream when run efficiently. But here is the factor that separated the merely wealthy castle owners from the genuinely powerful ones. Location: a castle sitting near a major road, a navigable river, or a key bridge had access to something that agricultural rents simply could not match: trade flow. Every merchant convoy passing through was a taxable event. Every boat moving goods down a river was a toll opportunity. Every traveler crossing a bridge owed a fee. By the late 14th century, the Rhine River in what is now Germany had 62 licensed toll collection stations between the city of Mainz and the Dutch border. 62 separate castles, towers, and fortified positions, each extracting a fee from every boat that passed. Certain castles were built on islands directly in the river, specifically to use chains stretched across the water, to stop passing ships and demand payment before letting them continue. In England, lords who held charters for bridges collected what was called pontage, a toll specifically designated for bridge maintenance and defense. Toll rates were precisely calculated according to what the traveler was carrying. A loaded wagon paid more than a rider on horseback. A rider paid more than a man walking with a pack animal. Every unit of commerce that flowed through a lord's territory was an income opportunity, and a strategically placed castle was the mechanism for capturing it. The financial lesson was clear. A castle near a trade route was worth 10 times more than an identical castle sitting in the middle of farmland. Not because of the stone, because of what flowed past it, everything described above. The staffing, the maintenance, the food, heating, the obligations, all of that was the cost of peace. When war arrived, those costs did not just increase. They multiplied. A besieged castle had to stockpile months of provisions in advance: salted meats, grain, dried fish, cheese, and enormous reserves of ale and water against the risk of a poisoned well. The cost of rapidly assembling that stockpile under military pressure was far higher than the cost of normal provisioning. Mercenaries, soldiers available for hire at short notice, commanded premium rates precisely because their services were in sudden demand, and if wages fell into arrears, they would simply switch sides. This happened with documented regularity throughout the medieval period. In 1242, King Henry III of England raised a large army to protect his lands in France. That single campaign cost £40,000, roughly equivalent to the entire normal annual income of the English crown in that period. One campaign, 1 year. The full annual revenue of a kingdom spent, and if the castle was actually besieged and the attackers used trebuchets, the heavy stone-throwing machines that could hurl boulders weighing over 100 kilograms repeatedly into the same section of wall, the structural damage on even a successful defense could take years and tens of thousands of pounds to repair. Even worse, to deny attackers the ability to use cover while approaching the walls, defenders routinely burned and demolished their own surrounding villages, mills, and orchards. They destroyed their own income-generating infrastructure to improve their defensive position. The siege ended. The castle still stood, But the agricultural and commercial base that had been funding it was gone, and rebuilding it took years. With all of this in view, the pattern of noble insolvency in medieval Europe becomes completely understandable. The most common path to ruin followed a specific sequence. A bad harvest caused by poor weather, flooding, or the kind of regional crop failure that struck England severely in the early 14th century between 1315 and 1322 in what historians call the Great Famine, would wipe out the agricultural income from an estate for an entire year. With no incoming revenue but full ongoing expenses, the Lord borrowed cash from Italian banking families to bridge the gap. The Bardi and Peruzzi banking families of Florence were, by the 1320s, the primary lenders to European nobility, with branches across England and France. When the war started, and in the 14th century, war was nearly permanent between England and France during the Hundred Years' War, which ran from 1337 to 1453, those borrowed funds had to be directed toward military expenses instead of repaying the debt. The interest compounded. More loans were taken. When Edward III of England defaulted on loans of 900,000 gold florins to the Bardi family and 600,000 florins to the Peruzzi family in 1345, both banking houses collapsed. The debts of one king destroyed two of the largest financial institutions in Europe. For smaller noble families, the mechanism was the same, just on a domestic scale. A few bad years of harvests, one expensive military campaign, one royal visit that had to be funded on borrowed money, and the family was mortgaged. The next generation inherited not the castle but the debt attached to it. Owning multiple castles multiplied all of these problems because it required duplicate households and skeleton garrisons at each location, compounding the total cost far faster than the total income could grow. Here is the honest answer. As a commercial enterprise, evaluated purely on the basis of what went in versus what came out, a castle was usually a bad investment. The construction costs were enormous and non-recoverable. The ongoing costs were fixed and relentless. The income was dependent on agricultural harvests that could fail, trade flows that could be disrupted, and political relationships that could turn hostile without warning. The biggest cost driver, war, was entirely outside the owner's control, arrived without notice, and could consume years of accumulated revenue in a matter of months. But here is the other side of that ledger. Within the political and social reality of medieval Europe, the castle was not just a building. It was the physical mechanism through which a family exercised power. It was the seat of a local economy, the center of a regional justice system, the base from which trade was taxed and roads were controlled and enemies were deterred. You could not collect rent across 30 villages without a credible threat to enforce your rights. You could not run a manor court without a physical location to hold it. You could not hold a strategic trade route without a garrison capable of defending it. The castle produced influence and control. And in a world where influence and control were the only things that actually kept you safe, that was worth paying for even if it cost everything you had, the most successful castle owners in history were not the ones who built the biggest wall or the tallest towers. They were the ones who understood that a castle was a tool, not a trophy. The ones who sat their fortresses on trade routes rather than hilltops for the view. The ones who kept their military costs lean during peace and their grain stores full before autumn. The ones who treated their tenants well enough that the fields kept producing even when the weather was difficult. A castle did not make you rich. Owning a castle correctly and understanding the difference between the two was what separated the dynasties that lasted from the ones that went quietly bankrupt behind their own stone walls. The greatest noble was not necessarily the one with the biggest castle. It was the one who knew exactly what his castle was costing him and exactly what it was buying.